Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
An official report into the case of an Iranian refugee who was murdered in Bristol has concluded there was institutional racism on the part of the authorities who dealt with him. Bijan Ebrahimi was killed by a neighbour in the summer of 2013 and his body set alight. Today's report by the Safer Bristol Partnership found that Avon and Somerset Police and Bristol City Council repeatedly sided with those who'd abused him over a period of years. But while the report found evidence of collective failure, it said that individuals were not intentionally racist. John Kay reports.
He came to Britain for safety, but Bijan Ebrahimi was brutally beaten to death and his body set on fire.
Don't you dare take pictures of me, all right? You come to my...
This is the neighbour who killed him, Lee James, now serving life for murder.
You come to my... I come to you...
But this was not the first attack.
You've got a mop outside my door.
Today's report says time and time again, at different addresses over several years, Bijan alleged he'd been abused and attacked by a number of different people. But this report says he was treated as a nuisance by the authorities in Bristol, with police and council staff often siding with his alleged abusers rather than helping him.
Absolutely shocking and disgusting.
Now Bijan's sisters have been told there was a collective failure by Avon and Somerset Police and Bristol City Council which amounted to institutional racism, a phrase used nearly 20 years ago in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry.
These are not the words that we should hear this day and age. You don't want to see, you don't want to hear anymore about it. It's been dealt with it so many times before, and seeing it is happening again, it's really shocking. We are very angry, as my sister said, and it's very shocking and upsetting as a family.
Today's report says no individual members of staff here at Bristol City Council or at Avon and Somerset Police were intentionally racist themselves, but it says both organisations had an ingrained view of Bijan Ebrahimi which affected the way they treated him, and that he didn't get the support or the level of service that he should have received. The report says, as an Iranian man, Bijan was put at a disadvantage because the way the authorities dealt with him was discriminatory. That's why it concludes there was institutional racism.
It's a word that's rarely used, it's a finding that's rarely found, because one would hope that institutional racism is not a common problem. But the family's concern, in fact, is that it is much more common than it is found.
Last year, 2 members of police staff were jailed for misconduct. The force apologised to the Ebrahimi family then, and along with the City Council, has now accepted today's report in full. They say lessons have been learned.
Bijan's death won't be in vain, and that it will be the basis of this authority, and I'm sure many institutions around the city having a look at what they do and the way they do it.
Nearly 5 years after he was killed here, Bijan Ebrahimi's family say his voice has now finally been heard. John Kay, BBC News, Bristol.
And our home editor, Mark Easton, is here with me. So there's institutional racism, but no individual is to blame. I mean, how does that work?
Well, institutional racism is obviously a troubling phrase, but it's a complicated concept. In this case, the inquiry, as we've been hearing, said there was no evidence that anyone from the police or the council intentionally behaved in a racist manner, nor that they had policies or procedures which were in any way racist. But the definition of institutional racism, was laid out in the Macpherson report after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, includes attitudes and behaviours which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racist stereotyping. It's shocking that the phrase institutional racism is still being used almost 25 years after Stephen Lawrence's murder, but it's also a reminder of how hard it is to change deep-seated, hidden, unconscious biases from affecting the way that professionals deal with often very challenging, very sensitive and complex situations. Now, there are recommendations in today's report to introduce additional oversight, training and checks into the system to protect against that unwitting prejudice. I think clearly for Mr Ebrahimi's family, the only solace is that we won't make the same mistake again.
All right, Mark, thanks very much.
Council and police force repeatedly sided with the abusers of a man who was murdered after he was wrongly accused of being a paedophile. Bijan Ebrahimi was beaten to death by his neighbour Lee James outside his Bristol home in 2013. A review found that police repeatedly failed Mr Ebrahimi over scores of calls that he'd made reporting incidents, including racial abuse and threats to kill, many not even recorded as crimes. And it found evidence of institutional racism and bias by the council and the police. As in Houken now reports, and a warning, his report does contain some distressing images right from the very start.
You can barely make it out in this footage, but this is the body of Bijan Ebrahimi being dragged across a Bristol estate in July 2013. Two neighbours douse him in white spirit and set him alight. By that point, Mr Ebrahimi, registered disabled and living alone, was already dead. This man, Lee James, had kicked him to death, but the investigations into the murder disclosed as much about the authorities as they did about Lee James.
No, you're not my friend, that's the point. I'm a police officer, you're a pain in the ass.
CCTV revealed unprofessional behaviour by police officers.
I'm expecting him, and I've got a mob outside my door.
999 logs recorded Mr Ebrahimi's increasingly desperate final attempts to reach his local policeman. The killing of Bijan Ebrahimi didn't happen out of the blue. It happened after years of racial attacks and racial abuse on the estate where he lived. It happened after years of warnings to the police. In total, he made 73 complaints, most of which weren't even logged. As for Bristol City Council, they attempted to issue him, and not his abusers, with an antisocial behaviour injunction. So you can see why the multi-agency review body that examined the case and reported today found evidence of institutional racism in both Bristol City Council and Avon and Somerset Police. The conclusions of the review are damning. They state,
there is evidence that Mr Ebrahimi was repeatedly targeted for racist abuse and victimisation by some members of the public, that this was repeatedly reported to Avon and Somerset Constabulary and Bristol City Council, and that representatives of both organisations repeatedly sided with his abusers. There is evidence of both discriminatory behaviour and institutional racism on the part of Bristol City Council and Avon and Somerset Constabulary.
But the review goes back even further. Mr Ebrahimi had moved to the Brislington estate because he'd already been the victim of attacks in Bedminster. Boiling water had been poured over him. So he moved to the estate where he was killed, hoping it would be safer. Today, his sister spoke about the racism he suffered.
It continued and happened again, and few times Bijan was let down by police and council both. As a coincidence, Bijan lost his life as a matter of discrimination and racism in level of the institutional racism. It was so shocking and sad.
Officers involved in Mr Ebrahimi's case have been disciplined, but the finding about institutional racism raises a question. Are there wider problems in the police? The evidence is complex. A Freedom of Information release from March states that in the 3 years that followed his murder, Avon and Somerset received 101 complaints of racism from the public, but no officer was disciplined. Today, however, the force told Channel 4 News that since August 2016, they have issued final warnings to 5 staff and officers. 3 others have been dismissed. The force said,
we recognise and fully accept the findings of the Safer Bristol Partnership report into the murder of Bijan Ebrahimi. We didn't wait for any reports to be published to introduce substantial and wide-reaching changes to the way we operate. We continue to do everything in our power to prevent a tragedy like this from ever happening again.
He was determined, he was a lovely brother, he was a very kind person. He was really missed by all families, and we're trying to keep his legacy and fight for his justice.
It's a credit to the police and the council that both now acknowledge the evidence of institutional racism in this case. But Bijan Ebrahimi had to die first.
Ed Harker reporting there. Well, earlier I talked to the mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees. Though he took up his position after the events described in Ed's report, I asked him first whether he was still sorry for what had happened.
Absolutely. It's, you know, you can imagine, I mean, I've met Bijan's sisters and nephew, and what can you say? I mean, they not only did they suffer the murder of their brother, but then a whole, you know, a process came in place in which they weren't being given the respect they should have been given.
And we've been over the police's actions or inactions a lot, and several police officers paid with their careers, indeed ended up serving some time in jail. But the council has not had to suffer that much, has it?
Well, the report the report was delayed in coming out. It's been a long time coming. I would consider that long overdue. And we must we have a standard as an organisation, and people need to live up to that standard.
But between 2005 and 2013, when he was killed, Bijan made dozens of complaints to the local authorities, and yet he was the one who received a civil ASBO, an antisocial behaviour order, not the people who ended up killing him.
Yeah,
and that was done by the council.
That's a perverse, yeah, and that's a perverse situation, to put it mildly. You know, he wasn't being given the respect he was due, and you know, my intention is to make sure that this organisation is one that does deliver people the respect it's due.
The police has paid for its mistakes. The council has not yet.
No, it's not a description that you share that I feel totally comfortable with, and I've been sharing that with my senior team just now. I think the police responded incredibly quickly. They met with the family, they issued an apology, they had a settlement, and this organisation didn't. And these are all things that now we've got the reports need to be, you know, this is not the end of the journey. We will build an organisation, hopefully, that delivers a better way of working with vulnerable people, delivers race justice.
But if there's anyone in the council today who was in charge when all these things happened, should they not pay for what they did or what they didn't do with their jobs?
Someone's been murdered, a family have been mistreated, and there's a long list of failures that go before that. None of that's acceptable. It's not acceptable to the family, but I don't think it's acceptable to wider society either. And you know, a part of justice is making sure that there is proper accountability.
You're of mixed race origin yourself. What do you make of the fact that your council has become the first council in Britain to be accused of institutional racism?
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole thing about institutional racism is one that I've been making repeatedly. It's not just about an individual orchestrating that, it's the culture, it's the systems. So there isn't, again, not taken away from the significance of that charge right now in this organisation, but there's no institution in the country that is free of racism, is free of institutional racism. That would be a very naive understanding of what racism actually is.
But if you make a blanket accusation like that, is the danger there that you're not looking at a specific institution, the one that you currently head, and hold specific individuals to account? Because you're saying there's a general culture of institutional racism.
No, there is that is a danger, and one that you need to avoid. But the danger of not taking account of wider institutional racism is that you strain gnats and swallow camels. You end up coming down and flogging one institution and leaving the rest of the country and the rest of the national culture untouched. And that's something we can't afford to do.
Marvin Rees, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.